Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us for another session in our series ABC of Marxism. Tonight, Ian will be looking at theory and practice of Marx and Engels, how did their day-to-day lives and their activities reflect in their writing and vice versa. There's something similar will be happening to all of us now in the next few weeks, with the general election being called. How do communists, Marxists, socialists behave in this general election, which doesn't really give us a great sense of optimism, I think. I mean, Labour, is it better than Tories or not? Lots of things to discuss. We shall be doing so in a new series that we're starting in June. More details to follow. But now over to Ian.
Good evening, comrades. Yes, it's kind of apposite, really, that this session brings us up to the momentous years of the First International, although I mentioned it a bit last week, and last time we met 2 weeks ago. This is the period of really the culmination of the First International and, in a sense, some of the most fruitful years of the work of Marx and Engels. This is a period in which Marx was completely immersed in his studies of political economy to write Volume 1 of Capital. During this time, we also know from reading the Grundrisse, from reading the correspondence of Marx and Engels, that Marx was also thoroughly immersed in rereading, restudying Hegel's logic. The Science of Logic by Hegel. There are two logics for anybody who is out to take this a little further. There's the so-called lesser logic, which is actually the only one I have, and there is a much larger, the Science of Logic. And it was that latter Science of Logic that Marx turned to as part of his preparation for writing Capital, and you can see references to it in the Grundrisse, as I say. So an intense period of study in both philosophy and the critique of political economy, and of being immersed in empirical data about everything from the kind of minutiae of reports of the Factory Acts through to reading and rereading many of the kind of classical political economists. I remember with the hair standing up on the back of my neck once when reading through Capital, there was a little footnote, and in the footnote it included some references to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Factories, which pointed out that average life expectancy in Liverpool in 1838 had dropped to 15. Put differently, the working class really wasn't living long enough to reproduce itself. Except, of course, average life expectancy is a slippery one, because what it meant was huge numbers of childhood deaths. An average life expectancy is dragged down by infant mortality. So Marx was a thoroughgoing theoretician, but he was also a thoroughgoing scientist of empirical data. And he used that relationship between theory and empirical data to inform political practice, because this was not only a period of intense study for Marx, but it was also a period of intense political activity. And we'll be looking a little bit more at the First International, and in particular Marx's intense debates with the anarchists. So a little reminder for those who are unfamiliar with it, or I've mentioned it, but it deserves a little bit more detail. Marx was only one of a number of quite a lot of people who were there on the day, as it were, when the First International, the International Working Men's Association, was launched in St Martin's Hall in London. There had been a meeting the year before, which I mentioned the last time we met, in recognition of an uprising in Poland in the 1860s, and this had included British trade unionists and French trade unionists and French political activists of one sort or another. So among, for example, the founding members were Henri Tolaine, George Odger, who was chair of the London Trades Council, which was close to the First International but didn't actually affiliate, and Edward Spencer Beazley, absolutely no relation, who was a Comtean sociologist because it's an interesting footnote to the whole of Marxism, in a sense that much of sociology grew up in response to Marx, an attempt to provide an opposition to the Marxist perspective. The kind of sociological perspective of Auguste Comte's positivism was being promulgated by Edward Spencer Beazley and among others. And interestingly, although Marx had nothing but contempt for Auguste Comte, he had some regard for Edward Spencer Beazley, who he regarded as an indefatigable fighter for the working class. The First International, at its foundation, was a great mass of different organizations with, as I mentioned last time, it could count its nominal membership in the millions in terms of affiliates and individual members. It's been argued that the actual active membership was probably something more in the region of 20,000 to 30,000. But in terms of people who were affiliated, then literally it could run into millions. It certainly had an impact. And although opinion is divided as to whether the International Working Men's Association itself could be considered as responsible for a whole range of things that it was largely subsequently accused of, is a moot point. There were certainly at the original meeting trades unionists, utopian socialist people, followers of Owen, for example, the residual elements of Chartism. There were still people who had been part of the Chartist movement, anarchists and Marxists, and it's to that division there between anarchists and Marxists that I'll mostly focus on. And Republicans of one sort or another, as well as nationalists. Giuseppe Garibaldi was a member of the International Working Men's Association, and others too. There were Irish nationalists and Polish nationalists who were members of the International Working Men's Association. So on the face of it, is this another kind of broad front organization? I mean, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because the nature of the party is something which has been intensely debated in left groups for years. And indeed, there's often been blood and snot all over the carpet on the basis of what exactly is the form that should be taken by the party of the working class. The First International was largely run by a general council, as it were, but they had delegated Marx to write the general rules of the International and gave its inaugural address. And one of the nice things about reading the documents of the First International is how readable they are, because of course they were intended for a normal working class audience, and from that point of view, they're sort of immensely rewarding to read, and a good place to start if anyone wants is anyway just branching out on Marxism. And before you dip your toe in the icy waters of capital, you might want to wrestle with the rules of the First International, because there's some very, very interesting lines, and I'll show you a couple of quotes later, which shows just how connected Marx was to the idea that the liberation of the working class is the act of the workers themselves, rather than it being necessarily certainly not a sect but even what we would sometimes call today a party. There were splits in the International, as is well known. By 1873, the headquarters of the International was moved to New York, so effectively to close it down, because it had become split, it had become effectively taken over by anarchists. And perhaps more importantly, revolution had moved into an ebb tide. For those of us who have, as it were, grown up knowing nothing else but an ebb tide, we've seen over the years, over the decades, in my case, 50 years of defeat, but punctuated by occasional periods of upswing. The important thing is that the ebb and flow of class consciousness and class action is not of itself just some kind of cyclical arrangement, but responds to real events taking place in the world. And arguably, we're in a very interesting period at the moment. So among the splits, as it were, and we're going to come on to the personalities involved, most of whom you'll know about, and I've mentioned them before, around among anarchists. And again, even among the anarchists, there wasn't a kind of unanimity of thought. So splits around mutualism, for example. Proudhon, who we'll talk about in a moment, was not particularly opposed to capitalism as such, but was opposed to large-scale capitalism. In a sense, you see the progenitor of what we might think of today as many in the Green Movement, who want to see a return to simple commodity production, and based upon mutual assistance and that kind of thing, rather than large-scale capital. But the biggest division in the First International was between, for example, Mikhail Bakunin and Karl Marx. And the reason for that, and the reason why anarchism defined itself in a very particular way, was because of its complete opposition to what we might regard as political activity. So instead of arguing for direct economical struggle, in the words of Kropotkin, versus political action. So do we stand candidates for parliament? Do we stand candidates in bourgeois elections of one sort or another? And above all, really, I suppose the fundamental debate is around the nature of the state and what the state is, and at what point one can abolish it. Both Bakunin and Marx would have agreed on the idea that eventually there had to be a society without a state. What they disagreed passionately about is the relationship of the society of the state to a wider society. So let's have a look at some of the people that feature in our story. Now, this is Louis-Auguste Blanqui. Marx had the considerable respect for Blanqui. Blanqui himself didn't call himself an anarchist. He regarded himself as a revolutionary, and he spent over half of his adult life in prison as a result of his revolutionary activities. But unlike Marx, Blanqui's attitude was it is insurgency and, as it were, individual acts of what some would regard as terrorism that should help to push the revolution along. Not by any means a brutish man. He studied both law and medicine. He took part in the revolution in France in 1830. This is a bourgeois revolution. 1830 is an interesting period in French history for all sorts of reasons. Among others, is the beginning of its imperialist expansion into North Africa. Blanqui and of course both Lenin and I think Marx also at other times used the term Blanquist or Blanquism almost as an epithet for those who would, for example, argue for a conspiratorial sect that acts in replacement of the working class. For Marx, revolution was about the class liberating itself and in so doing abolishing all classes. For Blanqui, the conspiratorial sect, secret societies, and insurrection were a way in which the revolution could be pushed on further and faster. Clearly, a courageous revolutionary, condemned to death in 1840, which was later commuted, released following the revolutions of 1848, resumed his revolutionary activity, and sentenced to 10 years, and so on. So he escaped in 1865, returned to France after the amnesty, and sentenced to death again in 1871, but commuted. At one point during the Paris Commune, the communards, which had a profoundly anti-clerical approach, because they wanted to see a complete separation of church and state, something which is, of course, taken for granted as part of bourgeois republican reforms. A complete separation of church and state was a feature of the Great French Revolution. But of course, the church had played a particular part in regard not only to the Ancien regime, but with regard to the state subsequently. And so they took priests as hostages. They offered all the priests in Paris in exchange for Blanqui, and many more hostages besides. The state refused, and Blanqui remained in prison. And the person who first called himself an anarchist, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, those are his dates, printer, compositor, and Freemason. You have to remember that Freemasonry at this time was actually regarded as a progressive, even radical, a progressive and radical element. Anyone who's watched Mozart's Magic Flute will be aware of the Masonic imagery in Mozart's Magic Flute. And it's abundant everywhere throughout the opera. Why was Mozart a Freemason? Because Freemasonry was effectively to make a religion out of reason. The line in the Internationale is, "Reason in revolt now thunders, and at last ends the age of cant," or at least it does in the English translation. Reason in revolt. So the idea, for example, that Freemasonry became making a religion out of reason, which is why you don't have the cross, you have set square and compass. So it constantly, having started obviously as a craft guild in the great period of cathedral building, eventually became a kind of club for those who were on the side of the bourgeoisie. So from that point of view, being a Freemason was actually quite a radical step. But he was the first person to refer to himself as an anarchist. Marx met Proudhon whilst Marx was exiled in Paris. And what started off as a cordial friendship, after all, Proudhon was by this time quite well known in workers' circles. He was far more famous than Marx. And even by the time of the Commune, most of the communards were followers of either Proudhon or Blanqui or Bakunin rather than Marx, interestingly. So Proudhon wrote his book, What is Property, in 1840, and later The Philosophy of Poverty in 1846. And their friendship broke down because Marx not only criticized Proudhon as being, a rather poor Hegelian, but also disagreed completely with what he regarded as his petit bourgeois anarchism, and moreover, the absurd suggestion that, for example, all property is theft. What Marx was at pains to point out, as we saw when we looked at some of Marx's labour theory of value, is that in the exploitation of labour under capitalism, the worker enters into a contract and, in a sense, is paid for the value of their labour power. The fact that their labour power yields more value than it costs to reproduce it is the origin, therefore, of surplus value in the first instance, and ultimately profit. So Marx was opposed to the idea that this was simply a question of being cheated, and was at pains to point this out. So Marx, in a rather barbed way, called his critique of Proudhon the poverty of philosophy, which is an early work of Marx, and it's an early work in the sense that Marx, in that stage, had not made the distinction, for example, between labour and labour power. He also, you could argue, in the poverty of philosophy, it seemed to go along with the idea that capitalism would eventually end up in the complete immiseration of the working class. And whilst one can argue that is true, it isn't in the way of just simply reducing everybody to the level of starvation. But Proudhon's anarchism rested really on a kind of mutualism, workers' associations and cooperatives, rather than the abolition of capitalism as such. So a kind of return to simple commodity production. exchanging goods with fellow artisans. He was briefly a member of the French Parliament, and he was very much a federalist and decentralist, and opposed to revolution, opposed to violent revolution. So completely unlike Marx in so many ways, and yet many of the communards were followers of Proudhon. A far bigger figure in literally, he was a huge man, as well as being a kind of a giant kind of personality, really. Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin was a son of the Russian nobility. He grew up on an estate which had around 300 serfs, studied at the University of Berlin, was kind of immersed in Hegelian philosophy, and had met both Marx and Proudhon in Paris. Was actively engaged in insurgency, and was consequently sentenced to death, imprisoned in 1851, exiled to Siberia, from which he escaped. He made his way to London and joined the International Working Men's Association in 1863. At the Hague Conference in 1872, there was by then a split, and the split largely occurred around the features of the Paris Commune, and the kind of condemnation of Bakunin's tactics of starting insurgencies wherever and whenever possible as the means of bringing about revolution was a constant feature of annoyance and critique by both Marx and Engels. If you want to read some of Engels' most vituperative criticisms of Bakunin, you could do a lot worse than read the Bakuninists at Work, where he criticizes the Bakuninists in Spain in the Second Republic, in the Second Spanish Republic. Again, Bakunin was in favor of federations of self-governing workplaces and communes, and opposed to what has come to be known as the dictatorship of the proletariat, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. Above all, what you see in the anarchists that was distinctive from Marx was an opposition to the state as such. And from that point of view, what Marx was arguing for was that there would have to be a brief period in which there would be some sort of state in order that the working class was in charge. The working class would have to be the ruling class for a period of time until such time as no classes existed whatsoever. So let's have a look at some of the documents of, as I say, Marx's writing is incredibly clear and lucid, and it was always a source of frustration to me when I was trying to get students to read Marx, that they seem to find difficulty with the language. But how eloquent and elegant is this? From the rules of the First International, considering that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves, that the struggle for the emancipation of the working classes means not a struggle for class privileges and monopolies, but equal rights and duties and the abolition of all class rule. You can't put it much clearer than that. And moreover, it goes on a little bit further. I didn't want to put the whole thing in. The emancipation of labour is neither a local nor a national, but a social problem, embracing all countries in which modern society exists and depending for its solution on the concurrence, practical and theoretical, of the most advanced countries. This stands in stark contrast to any kind of party that talks of the national interest, that wants to wrap itself in the Union flag, that wants to talk about I mean, at no point do we see in the writings of Marx and Engels any kind of reference to keeping out immigrants or whatever else. Indeed, the development of the International in large part was, how do we, if we're having a strike, for example, in Alsace, how do we stop people crossing the border to break the strike? If we're having a strike in Britain, how do we stop people breaking the strike? And the answer is that they all joined the International Working Men's Association. They all are part of the same revolutionary organization and refuse to play that game of workers undercutting one another's wages. What you see then is for communism, as far as Marx is concerned, only if it's not internationalist, it's nothing. And so therefore it has to be internationalist. You could take issue with concepts like which a social problem embracing all countries in which modern society exists. Well, what does that then mean about societies which were relatively underdeveloped or were not industrial or and so on? But I think the point is that from the point of view of Marx and Engels and the First International, is that it's countries where there is a proletariat, which is a universal class, which is capable of bringing in a communist order, which can be the end of all classes and all class antagonism. Even today, you can think of societies where effectively capitalism has laid waste to great swathes of the world. Countries which were in the 1960s and 70s prosperous, literate, and so on, have been effectively destroyed. And then we're invited and destroyed by imperialism, and then we're invited to believe that somehow poor people seeking a better life are the problem rather than the imperialists who destroyed their countries. But you don't see anywhere in Marx and Engels any kind of tolerance of nationalism. And what you see, in fact, if anything, is a kind of scorn, particularly for some of the British trade unionists who seem to regard Britain as having a kind of exceptionalist position within the world, and therefore and finding that expressed in the conservatism of their politics, a politics which was more geared towards a fair day's pay for a fair day's work rather than the abolition of the wages system. So the First International was resolutely internationalist. There are many very good books about the Commune, and I would recommend reading any of them. But what I would recommend anybody did first was read Class Struggles in France. And again, it's one of the most lucid accounts of it's one of the most lucid writings of Marx at all. It's free. It's out there on the Marx Engels Internet Art Archive. Let me draw your attention to this lovely picture. There's lots of really nice sepia-coloured pictures of the Commune here. These big cobblestones have been levered up to make barricades. As you know, Engels had done his national service in the Prussian artillery. And privately, both Marx and Engels were both critical and indeed scathing of the communards. Publicly, well, why don't I say they were privately scathing? Engels understood that if you stand behind barricades, you're going to die. That modern artillery, modern rifled barreled rifles, as opposed to smoothbore muskets, meant that the days of the barricade were over. And if you stay within your fortifications, you will be destroyed by a much superior force. From that point of view, Marx and Engels, in their correspondence, in their attitude towards the communards before they took power, their attitude was don't do it. Don't do it, because if you do it, you'll be beaten and you'll put back the workers' cause for decades. And of course, subsequently, that is what happened. Privately, Engels in particular was very critical because he understood the power of artillery. He understood the uselessness of barricades. Even the fact that they were of use before the Prussian army was able to enter, the French army was able to enter into Paris, meant that they were also a crushing liability once the French army was in Paris. However, we celebrate the Commune as the first attempt, really, at a socialist revolution. Moreover, it was one which had a profound impact on the way Marx and Engels saw political organization and saw what the outcome of what a revolution might be. most of the leaders of the Commune were followers of Blanqui or Proudhon or Bakunin, and this brings Marx and Engels to some of the criticisms that they made. So, for example, whereas Marx and Engels said, "Don't do it," once they'd done it, they said, "Well, march on Versailles. Don't just stand there." If they stay within the confines of Paris, they'll be beaten. So at least seize Versailles, at least seize the entire gold stock of the Bank of France and use it to promulgate the revolution, rather than just reverentially mounting a guard and protecting it. For those who are unfamiliar with the Paris Commune, it was largely carried out by the insurrection was largely carried out by the National Guard, which was a substantial number of people. There were 300,000 people in the National Guard, including women, in combat roles, by the way, not just as nurses or caterers or whatever. Famously Louise Michel, the person who's credited with giving the black flag to anarchism, and was fought on the barricades to the end, demanded to be shot along with her male comrades, but the very fact that she was a woman meant that she was instead sent off to exile in New Caledonia, but returned to revolutionary activity when she was amnestied. So what we see, one of the first demands of the Commune was the abolition of the standing army, a recognition that the standing army is the basis for class rule, and instead positing the National Guard, which was effectively the workers in arms. You can debate this. Clearly, there were petty bourgeois elements in the National Guard. Clearly, there were bourgeois elements in the National Guard. They were conservative, depending on from which arrondissement the guardsmen and women were recruited. So there would have been quite the whole kind of layer of Parisian life was contained in the National Guard. But among the demands, among the things enacted by the Commune, was the abolition of the standing army, and so instead you have the workers in arms. The abolition of child labour and night working in bakeries. Deputies paid no more than the workers they represent. I wonder how many people would be so keen to stand for Parliament for the Labour Party if that were still a feature. Separation of church and state, which is, of course, a basic liberal democratic demand, but nevertheless, in the context of France at the time, and of course, subsequently in the Russian Revolution, was a revolutionary demand. We often talk in terms of minimalist and maximalist demands when we look at, for example, the Paris, the manifesto of the Communist Party. But minimalist doesn't mean just sort of something that can be achieved within the next 6 weeks or whatever. It could be something as profound as ending the position of the church within society. The remission of rent. So people who were in massive debt to rentier capitalists would be forgiven their rents. The recall of deputies. So instead of having to wait 5 years or 4 years to put your mark of illiteracy on a piece of paper to somebody who wasn't accountable to you, if your deputies did not vote in the way that you expected them to because you'd mandated them to do that, you could recall them and remove them from office. A free return of all workers' tools from pawn shops. The abolition of the death penalty. Famously, the National Guardsmen brought the guillotine out and publicly burned it. Opinion is divided about how many of the communards were slaughtered after the Bloody Week, or during the Bloody Week, the final denouement of the Commune. Some have tried to play it down. I think, looking at some of the wilder exaggerations and looking at some of the attempts to play it down, I think a reasonable estimate for the numbers killed in the Bloody Week was about 15,000. Many of those were extrajudicial executions. Interestingly, photographs played a curious role. If you look at those faces of those people on the barricade there, these photographs were available at the time and were used subsequently to pick out who would be executed. Is that you standing there on that barricade? and then they might be shot straight away, or certainly prosecuted and sentenced to death judicially. Many of the judicial sentences to death were subsequently commuted, and typically what then happened is that they were shipped out to places like Devil's Island or New Caledonia or various other places. But it's reasonable to say that about 15,000 were killed in the Bloody Week, which is far dwarfs the Great Terror, for example, during the Great French Revolution, which is no more than about 5,000 people. And most of those, of course, were revolutionary factions pitted against one another, rather than the idea of workers just simply rounding up the aristocracy and chopping their heads off. So the Commune put forward for the first time a kind of direct participative democracy, one in which deputies did not get paid more than the people they represented, and were subject to recall at any given time. What also is very striking about it, and because of the impact on it, I mean, the manifesto of the Communist Party was treated by Marx and Engels as a kind of historical document after the revolutions of 1848, and they didn't feel that they could muck about with it too much. The one amendment they did make to the manifesto of the Communist Party was in the light of the experience of the Paris Commune. The figure that you see lying on the statue that's being kicked over, in the words of the Redskins, kick over the statues, is the figure of Napoleon in kind of in a Roman toga with a laurel wreath crown on top of the Vendôme column after it had been blown up and knocked over. Interestingly, the person who proposed blowing up the Vendôme column, because it was a symbol of nationalism and war and tyranny, was subsequently not only imprisoned but made to actually pay for its rebuilding. And there's this quote from the preface to the 1872 German edition of the Communist Manifesto. One thing especially was proven by the Commune is that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. So here we have the idea that the ready-made state machinery is not suitable for bringing in socialism. Does that mean we don't stand candidates? What you see time and time again in the writings of Marx and Engels is that they've advocated standing parliamentary candidates anywhere where you could push forward the interests of the working class, particularly if it was, for example, the establishment of a republic, if it was for the establishment of an extension of the franchise so that workers could have a say, if it was for freedom of expression, any of the gains that could be won through elections, they push forward in the interests of the working class. Which, of course, brings us then on to this question about the dictatorship of the proletariat. The term has effectively become dated because people associate dictatorship with Hitler or Stalin or whatever, and it just comes to mean brutality and no accountability. Marx and Engels were both thoroughgoing classicists and understood dictatorship in Roman terms. That is to say, a dictator could be appointed in ancient Rome for a period of time to avert a particular crisis. If there was an army at the gates of Rome, for example, and that dictatorship was temporary and could be revoked. They still remain subject to the Senate. Here, all that the dictatorship of the proletariat means from the point of view of Marx and Engels is that for a brief period of time, there would have to be a state, if only to stop the old ruling class retaking power. And Engels maybe have over-gilded it somewhat, because after all, we're not necessarily talking about the Paris Commune as being a huge expression of proletarian power. Many of them were artisans and so on. But nevertheless, the class relations, I think, are that once you get to a certain point, any revolutionary activity takes on a proletarian character, even if the people taking part are are artisans or civil servants or whatever else. The dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you know what the dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. So the response to the Paris Commune was bloody, and over 15,000 were sent into exile in colonies of one sort or another, penal colonies. Subsequently, many of them were pardoned, or there was a general amnesty and they were allowed to return. Many, of course, died in captivity. What's extraordinary is that France subsequently, from 1880 up to the First World War, entered into a period of great prosperity. And does this mean that somehow the communards were wrong? Does this mean that somehow the revolution had been a mistake? Certainly wasn't the view of Marx and Engels. They expected it to be defeated. They were right. And not only did they expect it to be defeated, they expected its defeat to hold back the workers' movement for decades, and they were right. However, if you cast your mind back to the last session, among the things that we discussed was in looking at the tendency of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, were the kind of countervailing tendencies that could play a part. And what France entered into really was a period of prosperity on the back of industrialization, of imperialism. So what you see is if you go back to the countervailing tendencies, increasing intensity of exploitation. The nature of the exploitation also changed. So instead of, for example, just simply increasing the working day, absolute surplus value, what you started to see was that the products that were part of the worker's wage became cheaper because of industrialization. And from that point of view, you see an increase in relative surplus value. So you're starting to see workers having rises in real wages while seeing rising exploitation. The development of industrial production, imperialism. This is the period, for example, when French North Africa is expanded to include Tunisia, Morocco, and so on. This is also the beginnings, for well, 1863, I think, was the beginning of incursions into what became French Indochina. So you see, although France, as a consequence of the Franco-Prussian War, lost Alsace and Lorraine with their valuable coal fields and so on, what they also gained was a considerable empire. So imperialism, a development of a labor aristocracy and the growth of a new middle class meant that France entered into this period which is often known as la Belle Epoch. However, it is also the period which set the scene for the development of the Second International and mass French and a mass French Marxist party alongside a mass German Marxist party. Only Britain failed to achieve a genuinely Marxist party. It had to put up with the Labour Party. With that thought in mind as we enter into our general election, thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrade. If you could stop sharing screen. Comrades, if you have questions, I would like to make a contribution, please click raise hand. It was a really very interesting introduction, Ian. I think I especially liked your very powerful and passionate defense of internationalism. And I wonder what organization you had a little go there while you were talking about those on the left who are in favor of immigration controls. And I think, yes, it's our dear George Galloway and his Workers' Party, who's got quite a terrible program. But we'll be revisiting that question. Interesting, the question, the tension between the anarchists and the Marxists. So if you've watched Oppenheimer, that very expensive film, and you're a Marxist, you will have, like me, sat in your seat like, what the hell? You know, when they're saying they're showing off about their Marxism, and the young lady who's being flirted with says, "Oh yeah, I know Marx. You know, he said all property is theft," which is quite clearly not Marx. And Marx really argued against that at length, as you pointed out. And it's also interesting, you know, all these. I mean, Proudhon's ideas of cooperatives, mutuals, and all those. I mean, it sounds quite democratic, doesn't it? It sounds quite good, and you see it a lot around now. Still, it is a very common thing that the left, you know, that's what we should be fighting for, and it could be part, isn't it? It could be part of moving towards a socialism, but it is not. Mutuals and cooperatives will not get you to socialism if you don't actually challenge the power question and the question of who owns the means of production. Is that where Marx and Engels really you know, what their key difference was then, and the need to, you know, make revolution and take political power as well?
I think that was crucial because Marx and Engels weren't opposed to cooperatives. There'd been a cooperative movement in Britain, of course, and it was a feature of what we see as Chartism. And so Engels would have seen the kind of cooperative movement growing in Britain. Of course, what they were aware of was, of course, that even the best run cooperative would be competing against capitalism. And it would be shaped by capitalism just in the same way as art or literature or religion or anything else is shaped by capitalism. And so the cooperative movement, whilst it would have been, you know, part of that schooling of working class activists like the Chartists, like the Social Democratic Federation, although they were scathing in their criticisms of Hyndman and others, so they weren't hostile to cooperatives as such, just scornful of the idea that cooperatives on their own could constitute a way in which you could have a sort of a peaceful transition to socialism on the basis of a return to simple commodity production. Because quite apart from anything else, abundance is a requirement for socialism. What you see in the manifesto of the Communist Party, there are parts of the manifesto of the Communist Party that are some of the most ringing endorsements of capitalism available. You know, they talk about the way in which it's swept away the idiocy of rural life. This is the way in which capitalism has hugely increased productivity to the extent that, you know, we can achieve so much more than we could under feudalism, swept away, as he calls it, the motley feudal relations that bound man to his natural superior. Capitalism, from that point of view, has no greater fan base than Marx and Engels. However, they also recognise, particularly Engels, having been taken by the hand and led through the horrible streets of Manchester, watching the suffering, particularly of the Irish population in Manchester, of just how capitalism was also destroying people's lives, and that wasn't going to be solved by a cooperative, however good they were. I mean, Owen himself. I mean, if anyone's ever in Scotland, please go and have a look at New Lanark. It's a wonderful place to go and visit. You see Owen's factories there. I mean, they were model factories, and probably for the period of time, they were magnificent places to be, and kids could get an education and the rest of it. But he didn't stop him tyrannizing over workers' lives, and they still got told off for being late for work, and they could still get sacked and all the rest of it.
Absolutely. Bakunin is also an interesting one. 100 people. I mean, he thought there should be you know, instead of a revolution, you basically have a secret society of 100 people who run Europe on behalf of the working class, on behalf of the people, and that would sort it. And maybe he should be on top of the 100 people and lead them. You know, I mean, they're all these people with their blueprints for what it should be like. I mean, they usually see themselves at the top of the pyramid, don't they? And of course, you can't get rid of them. Reminds me of a few anarchists still around. But how? I mean, for example, compared to today, when, you know, I mean, there are a lot of differences on the left, and you see the way the left talks to each other. It's if it talks to each other at all, it's more like, well, let's unite and forget all the differences we have. Usually they don't talk at all, but when they do get together, it's all hush hush. Let's not talk about what divides us, but what unites us. The famous maybe 90%, but 95%. I think Marx and Engels had quite a different view of that, didn't they?
I think that's the importance of the idea of the liberation of the workers being the act of the workers themselves. Pointed out that when the manifesto of the Communist Party was published, there was no such organization. The party meant the workers themselves, particularly those politicized. Now, the class, as we've mentioned before, is not just a group of who have the same kind of social standing, as it were. Notions around class are often distorted by sociological conceptions. The fact that Marx was quite friendly with a follower of Comte shouldn't change our minds from the fact that Marx was deeply scathing of sociological ideas, in the sense that the classes wasn't just all the people who happen to do a particular job. It was those who have nothing else to sell but their labour power, but more importantly, becomes a class for itself when it becomes a collective, when it starts to realise that historical destiny. And from that point of view, the proletariat, which has never been bigger, is merely a nascent class at the moment. It's one which has yet to come into being. And from that point of view, most of the sects have a kind of abstract relationship to the class, where at best they're kind of playing a guessing game as to where things are going to go. It's interesting that Marx and Engels didn't just keep a party going for the sake of it. They were active in political organizations and intervened politically when there was a flood tide in the class struggle. That doesn't mean to say we should all just sit about and wait for the class to get really browned off. It's a question of preparing, and that's precisely what Marx and Engels did. All those years they were writing articles and publishing and contacting other communists around the world. It was all preparation for what then subsequently happened in the First International, and once again after the defeat of the proletariat in the Paris Commune, they didn't just sit on their hands or just say, "Well, we just have to hang about and wait for the next lot." It's not just some kind of cyclical thing that happens as if like sunspots or something. What they then did was prepare for the next one, and of course the next one was potentially even more powerful because the proletariat was even bigger, even better organized. The German Social Democratic Party at its height touched every corner of people's lives, from their social life to political activity to everything. I mean, it was an all-encompassing feature of the working class life of Germany. And the French Communist Party, the French Socialist Party, the Parti Ouvrier, was huge as well. Millions of members.
But Marx and Engels were also quite critical one day. I mean, they didn't keep their criticism quiet of their comrades elsewhere. They were quite vicious in parts as well.
Yeah, absolutely scathing at times, and I mean,
and publicly so, right? It wasn't all just like for internal purposes or something, but you put it out to the working class.
I mean, Marx fell out with almost everybody eventually, because he wouldn't hold back on his criticisms, and even people who were quite close to him. I mean, even people like Paul Lafargue weren't spared. They were all subject to some withering criticisms from his pen, but only because he was arguing for a particular perspective, and which often people didn't understand. So famously, Marx says at one point, "If I know one thing, it is this: I'm not a Marxist." And he was referring because the way in which his ideas have been distorted, particularly in the French Communist Party.
What about then the Paris Commune? How involved were Marx and Engels actually, or were they viewing from, abroad?
Well, um, there were certainly Marxists who were there and in constant correspondence with Marx and Engels. Paul Lafargue, of course, was a survivor of the Commune, and Engels, with his extensive military knowledge, was constantly advising people, to don't sit there behind barricades and to advance. But to no avail, really. And there was, I think there was a sense, it must have been a bit like watching a car crash, really. It's just nothing you could do about it. But what they did do, I think, was leave us an extraordinary legacy about the craft of revolution. Even before the Commune, in 1852, Engels wrote a magnificent little essay on revolution, where he talks about insurrection and about the circumstances under which you should mount an insurrection. And none of those things would have applied to what the communards did. And certainly in writing about the Commune afterwards, there were things that were written at the time, and then there were things that were added, chapters that were added subsequently to learn the lessons of the Commune. And that's why the Civil War in France is probably the best starting point for a study of the Commune. There are lots of other studies which have a lot more empirical detail, but to get a feel for the balance of forces that were at stake, the Civil War in France is the thing to go for.
It's not entirely unlike the Russian Revolution, in the sense that the revolution was successful and then it couldn't spread, it couldn't take off, and so it was crushed and it was defeated. And as you say, the working class was set back many decades. This is something that's as it happened before, and puts of course communist socialists into a real big spot. What do you do once you've actually succeeded in making the revolution, but you're not successful in spreading it? I mean, do you push ahead, or do you give up? And you can't do that, can you? You can't invite the capitalists back. You have to try your best, and then I guess learn the lessons from it and inspire future generations. But if you don't try, you've lost already. Is that the kind of attitude maybe that they had?
I think, yeah, they had no choice. So they did. I mean, that's the point. They did learn the lessons of it, and they did then write about it, and they did then, so that they confidently expected there to be an even greater revolutionary wave, as it were, in the period after the Commune. They knew it would be decades away. But Engels, of course, lived long enough to see the foundation of genuine Marxist workers' parties in France and Germany and beyond. The question about what should the Russian revolutionaries have done once they were defeated, once you'd got to, say, 1921, 1923, when you could see that that's it, the revolution's been crushed everywhere else and we're on our own, what point do you say, well, because what they would have done before was packed up their bags, and if those that weren't in exile in Siberia would have been off to sit in Geneva and talk about the next one. They weren't in that position. They were holding state power. And what do you do with it? Do you just try and keep your powder dry and hold on for as long as you can? And of course, we now know what happened. By 1921, factions within the Bolshevik Party were banned. Workers' opposition was the last kind of organization that was effectively closed down. And effectively then the Soviet Union could only really ossify, and worse, to the extent that it subsequently acted as an impediment to the possibility of socialism for many more decades. But that would be the subject of another session.
But the important thing is, I guess, that we have to learn lessons from it and still talk about it, because these were two of the, as you said, most inspiring and most brave events in our history, and we have to learn what we have to do better next time so that this doesn't happen to us again. So you did mention the question of the state, and Marx and Engels changed their view a little bit in the after the Paris Commune, and they slightly adjusted it. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the idea that so instead of just taking office within the existing state and kind of legislating things into being, that whole state system has to be smashed and replaced with, and I don't mind whether we call it the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm completely comfortable with the idea, but above all, that it would be a different type of state. It would be a state which would exist only really to ensure that the ruling class didn't take power back, and would therefore necessarily have to use force. That's what states do. Um, Ideally, it wouldn't come to that. Ideally, in the old Chartist slogan of, peacefully if we can, forcefully if we must. Hopefully, by the time we see a revolution, the world will be so rotten ripe for it, it will happen peacefully. All I would say is, remember what happened to the communards. That's the price you pay for failure. Remember what happened to Salvador Allende. That's the price you pay for kidding yourself that you can just somehow legislate socialism into being. And when Engels writes passionately about the importance of getting insurrection right, it is with the full understanding that good militants will just simply be slaughtered in biblical numbers if the bourgeoisie is challenged and not overthrown.
Thank you. We've got a question in the chat, which I'll just read out quickly. Oh, sorry, on the dictatorship or the proletariat. Yes, I was going to say, Hal Draper has actually written a really interesting book on this question, a dictatorship or a proletariat. And I know you say it sort of implies we have to take over the state for a while, etc. I mean, Hal Draper finds only, I think it's 8 references of that phrase in Marx and Engels, and says, according to them, it doesn't mean anything particular in terms of we're going to have to crush the counter-revolution, we have to do this or that. It just means literally the rule of the proletariat, the rule of the working class. But yes, that could be the form of a state, but it doesn't imply, we have to do A, B, C, and Marx and Engels were not very keen on blueprints on that matter as well, were they?
No, and that's why, in the sense that the phrase has kind of outlived its usefulness. It's only useful because it contains within it, if you're familiar with the classical interpretation of a dictator in ancient Rome, of it being transient. It's a you only need it for a brief period to make sure that the ruling class doesn't come back into power, and the idea is then that the state eventually withers away. The reason why the argument with the anarchists was so bitter, in a sense, was because the anarchists would insist that the state has to be abolished immediately. Marx's argument was that they fail to understand what the state is there for. The state is the organization of violence by the ruling class. From that point of view, to abolish the state and not change the social conditions which lead to a ruling class is absurd. You have to change those social conditions, change the proletariat has to become the ruling class first. And only for that brief period before it abolishes all classes.
Because the state is not something you can just chop off, is it? I mean, it is a social construct. It is part of everything. I mean, they've shown this with the bases and superstructure type thing. It is very much everywhere, so you can't just take it off.
One of the great advantages of capitalism over feudalism, for example, is that the contract, the idea that you own yourself. You can freely enter into contracts. The fact that the labour contract is one that you don't really have a choice in, because after all, we all have to sell ourselves as the only marketable commodity we've got. But the fact that you own yourself, you're not a serf, you're not a slave, is a huge advance for humanity. The fact that the downside of that is that, as Rousseau put it, man is free but everywhere in chains. The fact that the corollary of that is that you have to sell yourself. All your relationships then take a contractual form rather than being direct and personal and human. It's a huge step forward from the particularism of feudalism, but it's not a truly human society. You would certainly want, for a period after any kind of successful revolution, to still accept things like, the inviolability of the person. You don't want to see people arbitrarily imprisoned. You don't want to see people arbitrarily deprived of their property, arbitrarily deprived of their freedom. When it comes to the property of the big bourgeoisie, yes, that will have to be seized and used for the common good. And not only on a national scale, but on an international scale. What do you do about a country that's been laid waste to? You just say, well, you all have to just stay there and starve, or do you permit free migration, but also say, well, we also need to develop that country. We also need to help out the people we've previously been plundering for the last 300 years.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, there's to the audience now, there's a question by Murray, and I think he's actually asking a question that a lot of people will feel. What is actually wrong with the idea of all property is theft? Is it not true that the superiority of the technologies of violence are only the concrete realization of the perfection of the means of exploitation and extraction of surplus value? And they're not just robbing us.
It feels like that. I mean, yes, it feels like that. The point is, though, that contractual form is also real. If you were to try, for example, to say, well, we're just taking over the factory and we're going to run it for ourselves, and the profits are going to be evenly shared. You're up against the simple fact that the capitalist owns the thing, and owns the thing legally. They haven't just stolen it at gunpoint. There is, of course, and it's some of the most readable parts of Capital are the chapters on primitive accumulation, where Marx points out that in the early period of capitalism, that primitive accumulation, that capital was often on the basis of forced expropriation, whether it's the dissolution of the monasteries, so therefore the land gets parceled out by the king. We'll give you this piece of land. It used to belong to the priests. Now give me X pounds of gold, and I'll make you a lord or something. So you see that kind of primitive accumulation. You see other forms of primitive accumulation in for example, the enclosures of common lands. Most peasants were completely dependent upon on age-old rights, for example, to collect firewood, to graze the meager few cattle on common land, and these lands were just taken and became private property. So the early period of capitalism was a period in which people were violently expropriated, and a socialist society would expropriate the expropriators. But if you look at the daily basis on which Amazon, for example, extracts a surplus from its working population, it's not on the basis of pointing a gun at their head and saying, you'll come and work here for 4 days a week and then you can go and earn your own money somewhere else. It's on the basis of a contract freely entered into, and one which is enforceable in law. And it's enforceable in law because you own yourself. I mean, you can get into a debate about whether you owned yourself, for example, in the Soviet Union. There is an argument that was kind of semi-forced labor. You didn't have the right not to go to work. But that's a whole different debate, and we can have that later towards the end of the series.
I also think though that it is this idea that, all property is theft, and which is linked, of course, to the conspiracy, to the sort of we have to build small sects to overturn the state, in opposition to actually a mass working class, the majority of the population, making revolution. And the more of us there are, the less violent it has to be. But these were two, I mean, they do reflect a different strategy. That idea is that if it's just theft, then we have to, thieve it back almost. We have to do it all in small secret organizations, rather than openly arguing for the working class to take over the state, to take over society, and on all levels, and take things seriously, like the monarchy, like the House of Lords, and not just sort of deal with this, my boss is the bastard. No, it's the whole system that we have to change from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, in Proudhon's case, of course, it was, these kind of mutual associations, mutualism, where handicrafts, and generally he was talking in terms of artisans and so on, who would make their products, and they would be circulated locally, or using labor certificates, for example. I mean, Marx has a different version of labor certificates, but these labor certificates would kind of circulate, and there would be an embodiment of the labor in if you make chairs or whatever. And Proudhon's schema ignores the reality of capitalism. Just ignore it, as if somehow you could just and you do see this kind of expression. As I say, you often find it in the Green Party, or you find it in some anarchist groups who just say, well, we just need to return to a series of communes, a series of collectivities, and they could just trade with one another. And in the meantime, all the real power stays in the same hands that they've always done. It's about a class taking power, not just a small collective, a little group of people, Robert Owen's. I mean, Robert Owen obviously moved to the United States, and there were Owenite communes in the United States, the very, very home of the most rapacious form of capitalism imaginable.
Yeah, but they're not the answer to capitalism, ending capitalism. I mean, Murray, I know I can see you engaging in the chat, which is sometimes a bit difficult to read with. If you want to come in, could you sort of click raise hand, and then you can have a proper discussion perhaps with Ian. In the meantime, Paul Cooper, I've unmuted you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ian, for the interesting talk. You mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I think, about talking about Marx and Engels, that they were actually men of action. There's this idea that they just spent their time in the British Library, just writing letters to other people and writing radical tracts and stuff, but they had been involved in the revolutions of 1848, and their commentary, especially around the Paris Commune, was particularly like having experienced defeat and the consequences of that. And I think like the Paris Commune itself was had a large input from the anarchists, and they tend to view that, I think, uncritically. And it's interesting in France, because the anarchists were actually stronger than the Marxists until the early 20th century, and that was their politics generally were seen as wanting. And I don't know if there is much of an anarchist critique of the Paris Commune, and it tends to be just rah rah rah. And I think the whole notion of political dialogue and exchange amongst Marxists is too often viewed as a luxury. The idea that a lot of the kind of left groups have, that like the revolution, socialism, is going to be achieved by everyone having the same perspective, is horrendous, really. I mean, the idea that you can change society, that you can change, by a working class that has the same outlook, seems unlikely to me. The working class itself is very divided, needs to be united, but at least, like in a family, needs to learn how to talk with each other, and a lot of left groups, internally, my memories of being in left groups, they'll be saying, oh, they're useless because X, Y, Z. And every left group, in my experience, has some amazing cadre, or activists who've got a wealth of experience, which just gets kept within narrow confines. And the whole activist left, if you doesn't get the benefit of their experience. And I think on the left, you seem to get either one extreme or the other. You've got this very rigid authoritarian view of other left groups, or you've got the extremes of we have to be polite with each other, we can't upset people. And it seems to me that we need to marry the two. We need to learn how to exchange about the world around us, but stay comrades and build action on that. And what we're doing now, when we meet and we talk, that's as much an action, if you like, as I don't know, organising in your workplace or demonstrations or all the sexy stuff. Really, that's my point.
Thanks, Paul.
I completely agree with you. I mean, for the record, I'm a supporter of the Communist Party of Great Britain and write, for example, for the Weekly Worker. But I'm under no illusions that that's the repository of all wisdom. I've cordial relations with the what is now the Revolutionary Communist Party, what was Socialist Appeal here in Durham. And I over the years I've had all sorts of really good comrades, everyone from Christian socialists to members of the Socialist Workers' Party, God help us, and very good comrades that I've worked alongside. I mean, I would have my own criticisms, and I'm sure they would have of me, but that's part of it, and I think that's actually an extremely healthy thing. I think the problem that the left has is when you get I was talking to one of the comrades on one of the Palestine Solidarity marches in Newcastle, and I was saying what I would join the Revolutionary Communist Party tomorrow if, for example, you were allowed to organise factions, if you were allowed to have a kind of a platform within the party. And his argument was, well, if we do that, then we'll end up having splits. Well, actually, the reason why parties split is because there's no democracy anyway. You can't even have a discussion. And it's one of the great tragedies, really, that a caricature of the Leninist conception of the party is what has dominated much of the discourse. Marcel Liebman's book, Leninism Under Lenin, was kind of a bit of a turning point in the way I saw the Leninist party. Marcel Liebman points out that Lenin's attitude towards the party changed fundamentally over decades. And the kind of idea that it's a sort of tightly knit group of professional revolutionaries that doesn't brook any kind of discussion, and it's anti-democratic, is completely a caricature. People disagree with Lenin all the time. He often lost votes, and sometimes when he lost votes, he would break with people and argue his point somewhere else, and until such time as he could win them round. The split in the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks is the best known split, but there were many divisions within the Bolsheviks themselves, and you'd spend days arguing over various points. And as I say, factions were tolerated up until 1921. But what you get now in, forgive me, the Socialist Workers' Party or the Revolutionary Communist Party, and previously, of course, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, is often the party line is never wrong, and the facts have to be made to fit the party line. And even when it's ridiculous, and what then happens is people have got no choice but to leave or split or whatever, or get expelled, or sometimes get beaten up and God knows what. You know, that you don't see any of that in Marx and Engels. You see the most passionate debates. You see, you know, people are not prepared to not have no qualms about falling out with people over political matters, but you don't see them threatening to go and give them a good kicking or.
I mean, much of Marx's writing starts with some obscure person that you'll never hear of ever again, that he takes to task and said, you argued this and you argued that, and you have to go, well, who's this? No, it doesn't matter. But he develops a bigger argument all around it. But he always goes on about this guy and that guy making mistakes and stuff. It's quite entertaining, and sometimes reading back then who these people are is also quite can be good fun. But they were constantly arguing, weren't they?
Oh, I mean, considering how much Marx didn't publish in his own lifetime, the collected works of Marx and Engels were under 50 volumes, so they weren't exactly slackers. But considering how much they didn't publish, and then you've got a whole volume, a great big chunky book called revolt. just one great long diatribe, one great long argument with revolt, Eugene Düring, who's got a whole book to himself for giving him a good kicking as well. And her Düring, you know, is a magnificent read. In fact, you know, you don't even have to know who Düring was to. Anti-Düring is still a great read, not least of which because Engels is a very kind of lucid writer, and even if you don't know or care anything about Eugene Düring, it's still worth a read.
Absolutely. Victor.
You mute, Victor. Victor?
Can you hear us?
You muted. There we go.
I can hear you, yeah, come on. Can you hear me? I only have a lot of background noise here.
Yeah, that's...
You can, I'm very pleased, comrades. There was two questions that crossed my mind that emanated from your discussion. You agree with Marx and Engels, seems, that the noble Paris Commune event was a mistake that set back the workers for some decades. Now, my question is very near the mark for some of you, but I'm afraid I have to ask it. Do you feel that the collaboration that some Marxists did with our Blairite, called Labour but in name only party, until recently, the one that was led originally by Tony Blair, led by Keir Starmer's Stormtrooper, would you say that was also a mistake? I have the comfortable position of saying that it was one that I foresaw and I chose not to fall for, though I did join Momentum and I eventually regretted that after certain instances like the disgusting way they treated Jackie Walker. And the other question I wanted to ask emanates out of your discussion, and that is about international workers' solidarity. And from that, you suggest that having national barriers, national migration and goods barriers, the sort of things that Maggie Thatcher's single market sought to abolish, those were a mistake, because we should be able to have worker solidarity, which will prevent the ruling classes from using one group of workers to undercut another. Well, when I saw how the workers' strike ended, that is the one that by the miners, led by a Marxist called Arthur Scargill. And Mr. Hasseltine was then able, that's Michael Hasseltine, the Tory minister, was able to use Polish workers to produce Polish coal and import it more cheaper, and putting our miners out of a job permanently and closing our mines. doesn't that show that perhaps hopes of workers' solidarity, negating the need for national barriers, may be rather optimistic, and perhaps the line of the British Workers' Party led by Galloway is more understandable in that context? I wonder how you react to those views. Sorry, thank you, comrades.
Good questions.
Yeah, no, excellent questions. I mean, firstly, I've got no monopoly on wisdom. But here's my view for what it's worth. I think the problem with the Workers' Party is that effectively you're going to get into the same numbers game as the Tory party currently is, and the Labour Party will almost certainly get into. How many migrants is enough? And what's going to be the basis for deciding who comes in and who doesn't? I mean, at the moment, what you see is sizable inward migration on completely legal grounds, on student visas, on work visas. Half of the people I work with at University Hospital in North Durham as nurses come from overseas, and without them, there would be no hospital, there would be no nursing staff. I have no problem whatsoever. I've got, it's a matter of complete indifference to me whether somebody is from Kerala or Easington. I'm not, it doesn't make the slightest, I take literally true that the worker has no country, as Marx talks about it in the Communist Manifesto. From that point of view, the workers' country is the international proletariat. And from that point of view, any kind of attempt really then to say, well, they can come in because they're Ukrainian and therefore white, and therefore they can be resettled in vast numbers, and we'll pay for it and open people's homes and hearts and all the rest of it to Ukrainians, but not those people from sub-Saharan Africa coming across on boats. And the Workers' Party will eventually get into the numbers game, and eventually may well end up finding itself in bed with some very strange people, as indeed George Galloway has himself. You know, he's been very cozy with UKIP in his time, and I think that's the difficulty with it. The other point about sort of Polish coal, for example, when I cast my memory back to Arthur Scargill, what was Arthur Scargill saying? We have the cheapest deep mine coal in Europe, and so this is the idea of you have a national coal industry. It is tied up very much with Arthur Scargill's notion of socialism in one country, which is not far removed from what the kind of scenario that Galloway's putting forward. Socialism in one country, even a country the size of the Russian Empire, of 1/5 of the land surface of the world, wasn't possible. What's the chances of socialism in one country the size of the UK? With regard to, for example, the European Union, there are lots of views on the European Union. I would have preferred the left to take the old kind of Trotskyist position of being in favor of a socialist United States of Europe than for example, either defending the European Union. No one wants to defend the European Union. You can see it's an anti-democratic, anti-working class body. But at the same time, those who backed Lexit, you know, the idea that you can have a left exit from the European Union, people like Tariq Ali, who should know better, and you know, Lindsey German and various others. The withdrawal from the European Union has been a carnival of reaction, and it has given a huge impetus to right-wing nationalists of one sort or another, including one George Galloway. And of course, we always have to remember that the people like Galloway, Tony Benn, you know, the man is treated almost like a secular saint by some on the left. Tony Benn was implacably opposed to the European Union. Why? Because it challenged the sanctity of the Westminster Parliament, the very Westminster Parliament that is the the executive committee for managing the entire affairs of the bourgeoisie. Again, we come back to Marx. You can't just simply seize hold of the existing structure of the state and use it to bring about socialism. So I would have been for a socialist United States of Europe. And from that point of view, away with all frontiers. If that then brings about the question of what does that mean? We're going to have 10,000 Nigerians turning up and wanting to work at the local ASDA. One of the things I was saying earlier, I think that what's missing quite often is an attitude towards what do we do about the large sections of the world that have been laid waste to by imperialism? I say we, the international proletariat, have a responsibility for saying, well, surely we're going to have to rebuild some of this stuff. I, for one, can't stand the weather. I want the right to be able to go and live in Cape Town for much of the winter if I want. And I completely support freedom of movement, but I think we also have to accept that some of the wrongs that have been done have to be undone, and parts of the world are going to have to be developed that have been laid waste to.
I mean, the irrational thing about sort of the immigration controls is that capital actually wants immigration. I mean, capital requires immigration, especially at a negative birth rate that we are witnessing. And it's fear-mongering, it's electoralism to argue against what actually capitalism requires. Also, I mean, they would want it to keep lower wages and stuff. But I think you pointed out in your opening, the answer really is organization, isn't it? It's actually organizing with those that come in, allowing them to work for a start. Not everybody who comes to the country is allowed to even work. So, their benefits ground just, well, give them the right to work, man, and then organize them in the union, organize them in international union. So you can't have people, Polish workers undercutting or, undercutting British workers, especially in a global capitalism. It is entirely it is absolutely necessary for the working class to organize internationally, even on the economic level. But there's very, very little happening on that front also because the trade unions are so undemocratic and really have no interest in that kind of future for the working class. They're very much about self-preservation and doing their own thing. If you get together internationally, you kind of maybe even work yourself out of a job, etc. So they're very short-sighted. Victor did ask you about the Labour Party as well, though. So maybe just to ask you back out on that, what should be our attitude now? I mean, we will get back to that issue over the next few weeks, but because there are no more hands up, perhaps we'd like to come back to that towards the end of this session now.
Well, I seem to recall there was a very good article in this week's Weekly Worker on this very topic. I mean, broadly speaking, I would say you vote for the candidate that are most likely to protect the interests of the working class. And that can mean, for example, in Rochdale, because of the situation in Palestine, hold your nose and vote for George Galloway. In Durham, I have no idea. I would prefer to vote for a Tusk candidate than a Workers' Party candidate, purely because of this whole question about the relations that Galloway has had with UKIP in the past, the relations that Galloway has had with people on the far right, and I'm very concerned that it will eventually form a kind of pole of attraction for a whole lot of opportunists. But nevertheless, I will always vote for an explicitly socialist rather than an explicitly socialist person, rather than somebody who's a Labour Party apparatchik. If I was in Zara Sultana's constituency, I would vote for Zara Sultana. Partly on the question of Palestine, but partly because she's, broadly speaking, on the side of the working class. The whole history of the Labour Party is a history of calumny, in my opinion. I mean, the whole Nakba happened on Labour's watch, and Labour has had a long history of defending of imperialism and so much more besides. So, but you know, would I rather have a Labour government or a Tory government? I'd rather have a Labour government. If only because the relationship with the trade union means that there is the potential for the working class to win against the Labour government that perhaps isn't there with the Tory government. Now, most of the trade unions are a little more than specialist branches of human resources these days, and so it's difficult to see what will happen within the trade union movement.
So
However,
even, sorry, no, carry on.
but you know, the fact that that relationship exists means that there is at least another opportunity for some sort of leverage.
So even you're saying, even with Starmer, you know, defeating the left entirely, clearing out every remnant of Corbynism, etc., does it remain what Lenin called a bourgeois workers' party for you? That's
pretty much it. I mean, you can even, I'm not even sure I would call it a workers' party, bourgeois or otherwise, but it's certainly bourgeois. I think it's marginally less horrible than the Tory party. If I was in Keir Starmer's constituency, I'd be voting for Feinstein. I wouldn't be voting for Keir Starmer. I won't be voting for, if the Durham MP is, you know, a Labour place person, apparatchik, supported by Unison. She voted in favour of a ceasefire, but she's never been to a single Palestine solidarity demonstration because in the end, she's a career politician. She's looking after herself and her pension. If there's a genuine socialist standing against her, I'll vote for them. If stupidly you end up with Tusk standing against the Workers' Party, I'll just assess them on the basis of which one is the least worst, in a sense, or which one is the best.
Not only we're going to have loads of independents, which some people think is fantastic. You have all sorts of people with all sorts of programs, you know, none of them united in any party. I mean, it's better than nothing if you can vote for somebody left, but it's certainly not not what is required.
In my village, in my ex-mining village just outside Durham, there were 3 Labour council members, and 2 of them were defeated by independents. Neither of them has got a political thought in their heads. And not only that, but they're not even accountable to a party. And they were just ex-members of the Labour Party who got browned off, or they didn't get selected, so they stood as independents. And that's what you're up against quite often with independents. However, Jeremy Corbyn will be an independent. And I hope, and I suspect he will romp home. My only regret is that he won't give Paul Mason a right good thumping while he does it, because Paul Mason hasn't been adopted, the renegade Trotskyist.
I know, that's a shame, isn't it? Okay, great. Thank you very much for this discussion, comrades. Finishing a bit earlier than usual, but that's not a bad thing necessarily. Next week, we're doing one more session of the Communist Culture Club, which I'm really looking forward to. It's in opposition to all this hoo-ha about the European Championships and Olympics in Paris, which is all about commercialism. It's all about nationalism and chauvinism. We're going to look at workers' Olympics and their sport and ours, and how it was in the past and how it could be for us. Very much looking forward to it. We've got 3 very good introductions. And then the week after, we're probably going to start something on the elections, electoralism, what did Marx, the Chartists, etc., etc. Lenin even have to say about elections. And we can also have discussions about who's worth supporting. So thank you for joining us tonight, and see you next week. Thank you, Ian. Bye, comrades.
Bye.